Your tomato plant is already dead. You just haven't admitted it yet, that wilted, sunburned thing clinging to a cage in your backyard. You watered it twice today, amended the soil last spring, spent $40 on organic fertilizer, and it still looks like it is begging you to end its suffering. Meanwhile, your grocery bill climbed again this month. $7 for a bag of peppers grown 1,000 miles away and trucked in on a supply chain that could snap any Tuesday. So you fought. You hauled in amendments. You ran drip lines. You nursed temperate climate plants through 5 months of punishment and called the shriveled harvest a victory. But the system you're trapped inside was never designed to feed you here. It was designed for a landscape with summer, rain and mild afternoons, and loamy soil that doesn't exist within 500 miles of your front door. You imported someone else's food logic into a place that has been feeding people abundantly for thousands of years on a completely different plant list, and then blamed yourself when it failed. The Toano O'odham weren't fighting this ground. The Akimel Odom weren't battling this sun. The Hohokam built entire civilizations on what this desert offered freely. They weren't heroic, they weren't struggling, they were reading a landscape that the modern gardening industry told you was empty, and finding one of the most biologically diverse food ecosystems on the planet. You're not bad at growing food. You've been handed the wrong list, the wrong assumptions, and a system that profits every time you fail and buy more inputs to try again. Here is the thing nobody at the garden center will ever say out loud, because it would bankrupt the entire aisle behind them. A prickly pear cactus planted in raw, unimproved, calcium-crusted Arizona calish will produce 2 separate food crops by its 3rd year in the ground. No fertilizer, no soil amendment, no drip system on a timer, no bag of mycorrhizal inoculant sprinkled into the hole. Nothing. You stick a pad in the dirt, you walk away, and within 36 months you are harvesting nopales in spring and deep magenta fruit in late summer from a plant that never once asked you to open your wallet after planting. A pomegranate dropped into that same alkaline ground. The ground every bag at the hardware store tells you is broken and needs fixing will push out 100 flowers in spring and hand you 20 to 30 pounds of fruit every single year for decades. It does not need your sulfur amendments. It does not need your gypsum. It does not need the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium cocktail that the fertilizer label swears is essential for fruiting plants. The alkaline soil is not a deficiency. The heat is not a punishment. The dryness is not a disease. These conditions are the exact evolutionary triggers that push a pomegranate toward maximum sugar development and the deepest flavor the fruit is capable of producing. So why did you spend $400 last spring on raised bed soil, drip irrigation parts, tomato fertilizer, and neem oil for a plant dead by July? Because someone sold you a story, and the story goes like this: your native ground is inadequate. Your existing soil biology is insufficient. The calcium hardpan beneath your yard is a problem to be solved with products, the microbes already living in that caliche, the bacteria and fungi that have been cycling nutrients through Sonoran desert soil for tens of thousands of years. Those do not count. What counts is what comes in the bag. What counts is the amendment. What counts is the input you purchase, apply, and then purchase again next season, when the effect wears off, because it always wears off. That is not a flaw in the product. That is the product working exactly as intended. Think about what a bag of synthetic fertilizer actually does. When you tear it open and scatter those blue granules across your garden bed, delivers a massive spike of soluble nitrogen directly to the root zone. The plant responds immediately, green growth, lush leaves. You feel like a genius. But down in the soil, something else is happening that you cannot see, and that nobody printing the label wants you to understand. The mycorrhizal fungi, the thread-like networks that connect plant roots to mineral resources. Across meters of ground, those fungi operate on a trade economy. They deliver phosphorus and micronutrients to the plant. The plant pays them in carbon sugars. It is an ancient exchange, millions of years old, and it is the reason wild plants in untouched desert soil access nutrition from rock and dirt without any human intervention. The moment you flood that system with synthetic soluble nitrogen, The plant stops paying. Why trade carbon to a fungal partner when free nitrogen is already sitting in the water around your roots? The fungi starve, the network collapses, and now your plant is dependent on you, on your wallet, on your next trip to the store, because the biological infrastructure that once fed it for free is dead. This is not a side effect. This is the business model. Every bag of chemical fertilizer is a tiny contract that says you will buy another bag next month. Every bottle of herbicide that promises a clean bed is napalm, dropped on the bacterial colonies that suppress pathogens naturally. Every time you rototill that soil in spring, because some book told you to break it up and aerate it, you are shredding the fungal hyphae that took an entire season to build, resetting the clock to zero and guaranteeing that your plants will spend the next 8 weeks without their nutrient delivery network. While you compensate with more purchased inputs, look at the Ta'ano Odom harvesting. Saguaro fruit with poles made from dead saguaro ribs. No tractor, no tiller, no amendment, no purchased biology. They built an entire ceremonial calendar around a food system that required zero inputs. Beyond showing up at the right time with a long stick, the saguaro fed them sugar, the prickly pear fed them vegetables and fruit, the mesquite fed them protein-rich flour ground from pods that fell to the ground by the thousands, all of it growing in soil that a modern soil test would flag as deficient, alkaline, hopeless, except it was not hopeless, it was complete. The fungal networks were intact, the bacterial communities were cycling nutrients at exactly the pace the desert demanded. The system was not missing anything until someone arrived with a plow and a bag of ammonium nitrate and declared it broken. That declaration was not science. Was a sales pitch dressed in a lab coat, and you have been paying the invoice. Ever since, every season you buy new potting mix, because last year's mix went hydrophobic and dead. Every season you add more perlite, more compost, more worm castings, more fish emulsion, more kelp extract, more of whatever the latest gardening influencer swears finally cracked the code. The code was never cracked, because the code was never broken. The soil beneath your feet, the actual native ground of the Sonoran Desert, already runs a nutrient delivery system more sophisticated than anything a factory can put in a bag, but that system cannot survive the chemical interruption you keep inflicting on it. Every time you follow the instructions printed on a product, designed to make you need more product. So the pomegranate that thrives in raw alkaline ground is not a miracle, it is normal. The prickly pear-producing food in Calichet, without a single amendment, is not exceptional, it is baseline. What is abnormal, what is genuinely bizarre, is the idea that you need to purchase biological life and pour it into ground that was already alive before you poisoned it with convenience. The anger you feel right now, that slow burn in your chest, when you think about the exposed receipts from 3 failed growing seasons. That anger is correct. It belongs somewhere specific. It belongs pointed directly at a system that taught you to kill your soil and then sold you the resurrection in monthly installments. But there is something underneath that dead ground that the fertilizer companies cannot reach. A set of rules older than agriculture itself. And once you see them clearly, the entire dependency collapses in a single season. Here is the law buried under 60 years of fertilizer marketing and irrigation subsidies. Stress is not the enemy of food production. Stress is the engine. Every plant that evolved inside an arid system carries firmware, written across thousands of generations of drought, alkaline mineral loads, and punishing solar radiation. And that firmware does something no greenhouse hybrid can replicate. It converts environmental pressure directly into flavor density, nutritional complexity, and structural resilience. The moment you understand this single principle, the entire logic of desert food production flips from a story of scarcity into a story of concentration. Picture a fig tree in coastal California with mild summers and ocean fog, soil kept evenly moist by drip irrigation on a timer. That tree produces fruit. Technically, but the fruit is watery and mild, pleasant in the exact way a hotel lobby is pleasant. Now picture the exact same species, rooted deep into calcium. Rich Arizona hardpan, baking through in August, where the air holds almost no moisture, and the afternoon temperature pushes past 112 degrees. That tree isn't suffering. It is doing what its ancestral code was written to do. Every molecule of sugar inside the ripening fruit is being concentrated by the intense heat differential between the root zone and the canopy. Every aromatic compound is intensifying because there is no humidity, nothing to dilute the volatile oils living inside the skin. The alkaline soil forces mineral uptake patterns that coastal soils never trigger, and the actual, measurable result is a fig with intense sugar concentration and flavor depth that no other American growing region can ever touch. Not Georgia with its summer rains splitting the skins open and inviting mold. Not the Pacific coast, with its fog keeping everything lukewarm and dilute. Arizona in August is the exact environmental pressure that fig genetics were optimized for across millennia of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern evolution. This is not a lucky coincidence. This is an absolute biological law. Constructive stress within the tolerance envelope of a drought-adapted species. It does not reduce the yield. It refines and perfects it. A brown turkey fig allowed to root deep and watered, infrequently kept dry enough that the soil bakes hard between drinks, will eventually punch its root system down into permanent subsoil moisture, and simply stop asking you for anything at all. It becomes self-governing. Mechanism that also operates in the juju, a species that spent its entire evolutionary history in the semi-arid continental interior, spanning across northern China and the depths of Central Asia, landscapes that share the exact same brutal signature as the Sonoran Basin, scorching dry summers, alkaline mineral soils, and almost no summer rain paired with winters cold enough to strictly enforce its dormancy. Every single environmental variable that makes Arizona gardeners panic is a variable the jujube has been solving for thousands of generations. The heat does not stress it. The alkalinity requires zero amendment. The low humidity eliminates every fungal disease that plagues it in wetter climates, and the brief cool winter gives it exactly the rest period it needs, following what its internal clock demands before flowering in the spring. But the deepest expression of this forgotten law isn't in any imported species. It is in the mesquite, the tree most people in Arizona walk past every day, thinking of it as firewood or shade or a nuisance dropping pods on driveways for thousands of years before anyone forced a tomato plant through an Arizona summer. Mesquite was one of the most important food crops on this entire continent. Its pods, ground whole into flour, deliver protein, complex carbohydrates, and fiber, and a mineral profile mirroring the richness of the desert soil the roots mine. The flavor profile reads like something a pastry chef just invented. Molasses, caramel, dried fruit, all occurring naturally inside a seed pod, ripening in June and July, when virtually nothing else is producing calories. That timing is not random. It is the output of a biological clock synchronized to pre-monsoon heat over vast stretches of evolutionary time. The pods dry on the branch in the arid weeks before summer rains arrive, preserving themselves without a single ounce of human intervention, waiting to be harvested and milled into a sustaining rich flour, a flour that kept entire civilizations alive through the most brutal desert months. What you're looking at when you line up the fig, jujube, and mesquite is not just a collection of quirky desert plants. You're looking at an operating system, a deep food web, logic where heat is fuel and drought is a strict flavor concentrator. Alkalinity is a mineral delivery network, and low humidity is a built-in preservative. Every condition that the garden center calls a problem is actually a biological function, performing work that temperate agriculture accomplishes. With refrigeration, pesticides, and sugar additives, the desert does it for free. It has always done it for free. The only thing that changed is someone convinced 3 generations of gardeners to ignore the code already running beneath their feet and buy inputs instead. Once you read the law clearly, onsen, you see the real equation. That stress plus adaptation equals pure, absolute concentration. The entire premise of hauling amendments and running irrigation timers stops looking like gardening. Trying to force temperate species through a hostile summer is just absurd. It is an expensive way to produce inferior food in an already perfect system, a system that was already producing superior food without being asked. So here is the move that costs you nothing and changes Absolutely everything. You stop watering, you stop amending, you stop fighting. The calendar and the system simply wakes up on its own. Picture a single mesquite tree standing alone in a dry dirt yard, where someone completely ripped out the drip irrigation 2 summers ago. Nobody fed it, nobody pruned it, nobody mulched around its base, and last October it dropped 40 pounds of pods onto the ground, enough calories to carry one adult through a month of emergency eating produced entirely from monsoon rain that fell while the homeowner was fast asleep. That tree didn't need a gardener, it just needed to be left alone. The moment human intervention stepped back, the root network went much deeper. The mycorrhizal connections spread wider, and the canopy filled out completely, shading its own root zone and trapping its own leaf litter, creating a perfectly sealed, self-composting ring of nutrients, 40 pounds of food from zero labor. That ratio should disturb you, because it means every hour you spent hauling bags of steer manure and adjusting drip emitters on a sad, dying tomato bed that produced 8 pounds of fruit before spider mites took it in June, was time spent actively working against the thermodynamics of this landscape. Now scale that entire logic completely sideways. A blue elderberry planted at the base of a sharp slope, right where your roof downspout dumps water during heavy monsoon storms. You are not irrigating it. You are not feeding it. You're pointing water that was already falling on your property toward a root system that evolved to exploit exactly that pattern. A harsh cycle of seasonal flood and brutal seasonal drought. The elderberry goes completely dormant through the months of May and June. It pulls moisture from deep storage and just waits. Then July hits, the sky opens, and within weeks it wakes up, pushing out massive, flat-topped flower clusters, followed by pounds of fruit, dense blue-black fruit, coated entirely in a pale silver bloom, flowers for cordial, berries for immune, syrup, all from a plant that asks you for exactly one thing: just put me right where the water already goes. That is not gardening, that is pure architecture. You are designing a gravity-fed food system, using the slope of your lot, and the totally predictable behavior of heavy summer rain. The wolfberry takes this principle even further into absolute absurdity. Most people have spent $15 on dried goji berries imported from China, not realizing the native cousin of that exact same plant grows completely wild, across every single wash and disturbed roadside in the Sonoran Desert. Lycium fremonti, the desert thorn, producing small bright red berries in spring, right before the brutal desert heat even arrives. And sometimes again, after the heavy monsoon passes in autumn. The nutritional profile is nearly identical to the high-dollar Chinese goji, incredibly dense in zeaxanthin, lutein, vitamin C, and iron, and the plant itself is just a thorny, sprawling shrub, one that happily colonizes the absolute worst ground on your property, the Kalish hardpan or the south-facing gravel slope, the dead strip between the fence and the alley where nothing else roots. You do not prepare that ground, you do not amend it. You push a cutting into a crack, water it 3 times, and walk away. Within 2 years it is producing fruit every spring with zero human input. The plant is doing what it did for 10,000 years, long before your house was ever built on top of its native habitat. You just finally stopped preventing it from working. And then there is the tepary bean, where the logic of less effort equals more food reaches its most radical expression. 5,000 years of Ta'ano Odom cultivation refined this legume into something that shouldn't exist by the rules of conventional agriculture, a protein-rich bean that germinates, grows, flowers, and produces a full harvest, using nothing but the moisture delivered by monsoon storms between July and September. No irrigation infrastructure, no well pump running. You scatter seed into dry ground at the first sign of summer thunderheads. The rain does the rest, and by October you are pulling dried beans off brittle vines that completed their entire life cycle on rainfall. Rain that fell while you were inside, watching the storms roll through your windows. Think about what that means in practical terms. The most expensive input in desert food production, water, has been completely removed. It hasn't been reduced. It has been completely removed from the equation. The tepary bean runs on sky water alone, in soil that never saw fertilizer, producing one of the most nutrient-dense staple crops available to any North American gardener. It Does this because 5 millennia of indigenous selection pressure optimized it for exactly the conditions that modern gardening advice tells you are impossible. The monsoon is not an obstacle to work around. It is the entire engine. The alkaline caliche is not a problem to fix. It is the exact medium this plant evolved inside. This is the pattern that keeps repeating once you finally see it. The elderberry wants the drainage swale. The wolfberry wants the worst patch of ground. The tepary bean wants the monsoon and absolutely nothing else. And the mesquite just wants you to leave. Every single one of these plants is asking for less intervention, not more, less water, less amendment, and much less attention, less of you standing between the organism and the conditions it adapted to, and in exchange for that withdrawal of effort, the nutritional output goes up. The system doesn't need you to push it, just stop holding it back. Every hour of labor you remove, every input you refuse to buy, every amendment you leave in the bag at the hardware store is not neglect. That isn't neglect, it is the exact lever you need to pull. You aren't doing less because you're somehow lazy. You're doing less because doing less is the mechanism by which this particular ecology unlocks its own true productivity. The desert has been feeding people for 5,000 years on this exact principle, and the only thing that broke the cycle was a new gardening philosophy, one that insisted effort and expense were prerequisites for growing food. Picture the next satisfying disruption in the supply chain. It could be a drought that empties the Colorado River allocation, or a diesel price spike that doubles the cost of trucking California lettuce. Could be another panic that strips the produce aisle bare in 48 hours. You have seen it happen before. You watched people fight over wilted romaine. Romaine wrapped in plastic, shipped 1,400 miles to sit under fluorescent lights in a refrigerated case. That costs more electricity per hour than your entire house. You watched the price of a single bell pepper climb past $4, while the people buying it had absolutely no idea that a chiltepin plant growing against the east wall of their own home, requiring nothing from them except the occasional deep soak, was producing more heat, more flavor, and more nutritional density than anything sealed in that plastic clamshell container ever could. That pepper has been feeding families in this exact landscape for thousands of years, without a single invoice, a single truck, or a single middleman, standing between the harvested fruit and the mouth. Now zoom out from that single plant and see the full picture of what you've built if you followed the logic to its conclusion. A mesquite tree dropping more protein per acre than any irrigated row crop. Prickly pear pads regenerating much faster than you can even harvest them, each one a complete meal of fiber, moisture, and essential minerals, pulled entirely from the desert air and monsoon rain alone. Tepary beans scattered into bare ground in July, returning a full dried harvest by October, without a single dollar spent on water, fertilizer, or infrastructure. A pomegranate hedge, fruiting so heavily in September that you are giving away bags to neighbors who are still buying imported pomegranate seeds in plastic cups for $6 each at the local grocery store. Date palms overhead, converting the brutal summer heat that everyone else curses into the sweetest, most calorie-dense fruit available from any tree on this continent. Citrus ripening through winter. Pomelos the size of a child's head, full of clean, sweet flesh that tastes nothing like the bitter commercial grapefruit. People settle for it because they've never tasted what Arizona sun actually does to citrus sugar levels when the tree is rooted deep in alkaline soil and simply left alone to do its own work. None of this required a greenhouse or raised beds filled with imported soil. None of it required a drip irrigation controller connected to your phone. None of it required a monthly subscription to a seed company or a weekend trip to the garden center for another bag of amendments. Every single one of these plants evolved to thrive in the exact conditions that the conventional gardening world confidently told you were completely impossible. The heat is not your enemy, the alkaline soil is not your enemy, and the low rainfall is certainly not your enemy. These are the specific conditions that activate the food production capacity of plants, selected over millennia precisely because they convert desert into dinner without asking for permission from absolutely anyone. This is where the conversation stops being about gardening entirely and starts being about something that matters far more. When the next crisis hits, and it inevitably will, the people who built their food systems around the industrial supply chain will just do what they always do. They will panic. They will drive to the store. They will find empty shelves or prices that have completely tripled overnight. They'll feel that specific helplessness that comes from a dark realization. Their family eats tonight only if a system they do not control, a system they cannot see and cannot influence, decides to keep functioning. That feeling is not accidental. It is the designed outcome of a food infrastructure that profits entirely from your dependence and collapses. The moment any single link in its chain breaks, you will not be in that line. You will walk into your backyard, or your front yard, or the strip of land along your south-facing wall, and pick what your family needs for the week. From plants that owe nothing to diesel and absolutely nothing to refrigeration, nothing to the stock price of a logistics company you've never heard of. The pomegranate doesn't care about freight rates. The mesquite doesn't notice the grid. The date palm has been producing food in this desert for a very long time, since long before the concept of a grocery store even existed. These plants are not your hobby, they are your insurance policy, written in living wood, deep roots and fruit that ripens, whether or not the actual economy decides to cooperate. What you hold when you hold a bowl of tepary beans, harvested entirely from the seasonal monsoon rain, or a handful of chiltepins dried on your kitchen counter, or a pomelo pulled from a tree you planted 5 years ago, and have barely thought about since, is certainly not produce. It is proof that you do not need their permission to eat. It is evidence that the desert was never the wasteland they told you it was. It is the physical, edible, undeniable fact of true food sovereignty in the hottest, driest, most supposedly hostile growing environment in this country. It was always available to anyone willing to stop importing failure and start planting what actually belongs here. Because this is not a garden.